30 minutes before her wedding, he looked her in the eyes and said the words no bride should ever hear. I can't marry you, because you can't walk. The guests froze. The doors slammed. And as her world collapsed in that rain-soaked garden, a stranger stepped forward, one who would do the unthinkable. Before we jump in, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what kind of story do you crave next? Drop your answer in the comments below. If stories like this grip your heart and refuse to let go, well, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I've got another powerful story coming your way tomorrow, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Now, let's get into today's story. The storm didn't wait for the vows. Thunder rolled over St. Matthew's Chapel as white rose petals scattered across the stone path like pieces of a promise breaking. Inside, guests whispered. Outside, beneath the arch, Janet Collins sat motionless in her wheelchair, a bride in lace, alone. 20 minutes ago, her fiancé had walked out. No note. No explanation. Just the echo of dress shoes fading down the corridor and a sentence that would carve itself into her memory. I can't do this, Janet. She'd survived the accident that shattered her spine, rebuilt her life inch by inch, learned to smile through pain, but nothing had prepared her for this kind of fall. The kind where your heart hits the ground before your body ever could. She looked down at her bouquet. The stems trembled between her fingers. Mascara streaked her cheeks. Behind her, laughter from another wedding floated from the chapel next door, a cruel reminder that someone else's forever was beginning while hers had just ended. Then, a small voice. Daddy, why is the lady crying? Janet blinked, startled. Near the gate stood a man in a navy suit, tall, composed, holding the hand of a little girl in a cream dress. They didn't belong to this place of ruin. Yet the man's eyes found hers and didn't look away. No pity. No horror. Just quiet understanding, as if he recognized the sound of something breaking because he'd heard it before. He whispered to the girl, who nodded, then tiptoed forward, clutching a single rose she'd plucked from the garden border. This is for you, the child said softly. Janet's throat tightened. Thank you. What's your name? Anna. The girl smiled shyly. Daddy says people cry when something really sad happens, or when something really brave does. Behind her, the man stepped closer, the rain light catching the silver at his temples. I'm Richard Franco, he said quietly. We were just passing by. I'm sorry for intruding. You're not, Janet murmured. Her voice cracked. I was starting to think no one could see me at all. Richard hesitated, then said something that made her look up. I know that look, he whispered. It's the one you wear when you don't know how to keep breathing after someone stops choosing you. And just like that, the rain eased. The world held its breath. Two strangers, both carrying losses too heavy to name, met beneath a storm that had no intention of stopping, and neither of them knew that this moment, born in heartbreak, would rewrite everything that came after. That was the day Janet Collins's wedding ended, and the day Richard Franco stepped into her story. What began as an apology in the rain would become a journey through grief, healing, and the kind of love that doesn't flinch when life gets hard. The air still smelled of rain and wilted roses. Janet wiped at her cheeks, smearing more mascara than tears, and found herself staring at the man standing only a few feet away. He was tall, the kind of tall that carried quiet authority rather than arrogance, his suit darkened by the drizzle. The little girl beside him held a white rose as if it was something sacred, her small fingers brushing off the water droplets before holding it out again, insisting that Janet take it. Janet hesitated, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or turn away altogether. Yet the child's sincerity disarmed her in a way that nothing else had managed all morning. Slowly, she took the flower, its stem trembling in her hand like her heart was in it. Thank you, she said softly. You didn't have to. Anna, her tiny curls damp from the mist, shook her head with the seriousness only children can muster. Daddy says we should always give something beautiful to someone who's sad. Janet's throat tightened again. She forced a fragile smile, nodding slightly, then looked at the man, Richard Franco, he had said his name was. He didn't move closer or look at her with pity. His gaze was steady, kind, and strangely familiar in its stillness. He seemed like someone who had lived through storms before and knew better than to speak too soon. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the humiliated bride and the stranger who didn't seem to flinch from her brokenness. I'm sorry, she whispered, glancing down, embarrassed by the streaks of makeup and the soaked hem of her dress. You probably have somewhere to be. You don't have to stand here. Richard took a slow breath, his voice calm but firm. I'm not in a rush. It wasn't the words themselves that struck her, it was the way he said them. Like time could bend for compassion. She tried to look away, tried to find anger again to hide behind, but all she found was exhaustion. The rain had stopped, yet her world still dripped in silence. Richard's daughter looked between them, sensing something too complex for her age. "Daddy, can we help her?" Janet let out a shaky breath that might have been a laugh if it weren't so sad. "No one can help me, sweetheart." "Not really." Richard crouched beside Anna, speaking gently but loud enough for Janet to hear. "Sometimes helping isn't about fixing, it's about staying." He stood again and looked at Janet with that same measured warmth. "I know that look," he said quietly. "The one that says you don't know what to do now that everything's fallen apart." Something in Janet's chest tightened defensively. Her voice came sharper than she intended. "And what would you know about that?" The wind tugged at his jacket. For a heartbeat, he said nothing. Then his eyes softened, shadowed by something old and unspoken. "More than you think," he replied. There was no performance in it. Just truth, heavy and unpolished. Janet didn't know why that simple sentence made her blink hard, as though it had peeled back a layer she wasn't ready to expose. She wanted to ask what he meant, but her throat refused to cooperate. Richard gestured gently toward a bench under the chapel archway. "May I?" he asked, indicating whether he could sit. Janet nodded, and for the first time that day, she wasn't surrounded by people offering rehearsed sympathy or whispered prayers. Just the sound of a child humming to herself and a stranger sitting close enough to share the silence. Through the reflection of the chapel glass, Janet could see them, the gleam of her wheelchair's metal rims, the pale shimmer of Anna's dress, and Richard's face half-lit by the grey sky. The image felt surreal, like a portrait painted by grief itself. "I used to heal people," Janet murmured finally, tracing the rim of her wheelchair absent-mindedly. "That was my job. Physical therapy. I helped people walk again. And now," she laughed bitterly, "now I can't even stand for myself." Richard's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. "You still can. Just not the way you used to." Her eyes lifted, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means strength changes shape," he said simply. "Sometimes standing looks like sitting still and surviving." Something inside her wavered. No one had spoken to her like that since the accident, without pity, without the need to fix or comfort her. Just honesty. She wanted to ask him more, how he could speak that way, what pain had taught him those words, but before she could, Anna came running over, clutching her rose stem like a victory flag. "Look," she said brightly, "it's not broken, even though it fell." Janet smiled faintly. "You're right. It's not." Richard watched them, that ghost of a smile touching his face. "She has a way of seeing what adults forget," he said quietly. Then, after a pause, "Janet, you don't have to stay here. The rain stopped, but it's still cold." "I'm fine," she started to say, but the word caught in her throat. She wasn't fine, and they both knew it. The silence between them said as much. He stepped forward, not close enough to startle her, but close enough to matter. "I don't save people," Richard said. His tone was low, almost reverent. "I just don't walk away when they're hurting." Janet's breath trembled. No one had stayed since the day she lost everything. Not friends, not colleagues, not even Ethan in the end. They had all retreated, slowly, like the tide. Yet here was a man who didn't owe her anything, standing in her wreckage without flinching. She looked at Anna, who was spinning clumsily in circles, letting her small shoes splash the puddles that reflected what was left of the afternoon light. For a second, Janet envied the child's ease with the world. "Why are you really here?" Janet asked finally. Richard's gaze flickered toward his daughter. "We were early for a charity auction nearby," he said. "She saw you through the gate and refused to keep walking. I thought maybe we'd just check if you were okay." Janet nodded slowly, her eyes glancing toward the chapel door that had closed behind Ethan hours, or was it minutes, ago. "I'm not," she whispered. "But thank you for asking." Richard's hand brushed the back of her wheelchair lightly, not in control but in quiet solidarity. "Let's get you out of the rain," he suggested. "There's a cafe across the street. Warm lights. Better air than this place." Janet hesitated. Pride flared briefly, an old reflex from the days when she didn't need help. But then she caught sight of her reflection again, a bride still wearing heartbreak like a veil. Maybe she didn't need saving, but maybe she didn't need to drown alone either. She gave a small nod. Just for a few minutes, she said. Richard smiled, a tired but genuine smile, then glanced at his daughter. Anna, would you lead the way? Anna's grin could have lit the entire garden. She ran ahead, hopping over puddles as Richard gently took hold of Janet's chair handles. She didn't protest. The touch felt careful, almost reverent. As he guided her through the open gate, Janet felt the faintest warmth return to her chest, the first flicker of trust she didn't understand yet. The chapel bells rang in the distance, their echo soft and bittersweet. She didn't look back at the altar or the shattered dream it held. The air beyond the gate smelled of rain and coffee and something else she couldn't name yet, something that felt like the smallest possibility of beginning again. Before we go further, if this moment touched something in you, if you've ever been left in a season when you needed someone to simply stay, drop a rose in the comments. That was how Janet Collins left her wedding in the rain, guided not by love lost, but by the quiet hand of a stranger who refused to walk away. What she didn't know yet was that this small act of kindness wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of everything that would heal her next. The cafe across the street from St. Matthew's was small and warm, the kind of place where the air always smelled faintly of cinnamon and old wood. Its windows were fogged from the drizzle outside, and tiny lamps glowed on each table like flickers of hope. Janet sat by the window, her damp gown gathered awkwardly around her chair, the lace heavy with rainwater and heartbreak. A waitress had wordlessly brought them cocoa, 2 steaming cups for the adults, one with extra whipped cream for Anna, but none of them had touched it yet. Outside, the world moved on. Cars passed, people hurried under umbrellas, laughter spilled from somewhere down the street. Life went on, indifferent to her ruined wedding day. Janet's hand stayed clasped in her lap as she tried to process the surreal quiet that had replaced the chaos of the morning. The sound of the storm had faded, but the ache inside her hadn't. Across from her, Richard sat with his elbows resting on the table, his posture calm but his eyes carrying something unspoken. Anna was beside him, humming softly as she stirred her cocoa with a spoon twice her size. Every few seconds, she glanced between her father and Janet as though she could sense something important happening, even if she didn't understand what it was. Janet broke the silence first. "You really didn't have to bring me here," she said softly, her voice still hoarse from crying. "I probably ruined your plans for the day." Richard shook his head. "You didn't ruin anything," he said. "The auction wasn't that important. Some things take priority." She frowned slightly, half to herself. "You don't even know me." He met her eyes, steady. "Maybe not. But I know what it looks like when someone's trying to hold themselves together after everything's fallen apart." Something about his tone made her look at him more closely. His face wasn't the kind you'd call gentle at first glance, sharp features, faint lines of exhaustion at the edges, but there was a quiet warmth behind his reserve, like someone who'd had to learn calm the hard way. Janet reached for her cup but didn't drink. "You said earlier you know what it feels like to lose something," she said quietly. "What did you mean by that?" For a moment, he didn't answer. He looked out the window instead, watching raindrops chase each other down the glass. The silence stretched long enough that Janet almost withdrew the question, but then he spoke. "My wife," he said finally, the words slow and deliberate, as if each one had to fight its way out. "She left 3 years ago." Janet blinked, surprised. "I'm sorry," she murmured automatically. Richard nodded once, but his expression didn't change. "It was after Anna's diagnosis," he continued. "Heart condition. It's rare, but serious. Some days she runs around like any other kid. Other days she can't even get out of bed." His gaze softened as he looked at his daughter. Her mother couldn't handle it. The fear, the hospitals, the uncertainty. She said she wasn't built for that kind of life. So she left. The sound of Anna's spoon clinking against the cup filled the silence. Janet didn't know what to say. The image of that woman walking away from her child, this sweet, bright little girl who had just offered a stranger a rose, was almost impossible to fathom. "Anna was too," Richard said. "She doesn't remember much, and maybe that's a blessing. But she still asks sometimes." Right on cue, Anna looked up from her cocoa. "Mommy said she'd come back," she said softly. "She never did." Janet's chest tightened at the smallness of her voice. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered. Anna smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's okay. Daddy says she just got lost for a long time." Richard reached over, brushing his hand gently over his daughter's curls. "That's right," he said quietly. "She just got lost." Janet's fingers tightened around her cup. You've had to be everything for her, she said. It wasn't a question. Richard gave a small, humorless smile. I do my best. I run my company from home most days now. The house is quiet, but she keeps it from feeling empty. There was something raw in his honesty that caught her off guard. She wasn't used to people speaking openly about their pain. It made the world feel too intimate, too unguarded. Yet here they were, two people sitting in a cafe between storms, both shaped by the same kind of abandonment. Do you ever get angry? She asked after a long pause. Every day, he admitted. Not always at her. Sometimes at myself. Sometimes at the universe. He met her eyes again. But mostly, I just try not to let Anna see it. Janet studied him, and for the first time, the strength she had mistaken for composure looked like what it truly was, endurance. So you keep smiling for her, she said softly. Richard nodded once, his lips curving in a way that wasn't quite a smile. Exactly. The waitress came by to refill their cups, but neither adult moved to drink. Outside, the rain had thinned to a gentle drizzle, and a pale light filtered through the clouds. Janet felt the heaviness in her chest shift slightly, not lifting, but rearranging into something more bearable. It was strange, this quiet understanding between them. His loss wasn't her loss, but it rhymed with it. Both had been left behind by people who couldn't bear the weight of imperfection. She stared into her cocoa for a long moment before whispering, Sometimes I wonder if there's something about people like us that makes it easy to leave. Richard tilted his head. People like us. The ones who fight to stay strong, she said. The ones who make it look easy. Maybe we make it too easy for others to walk away because we never let them see how much we are breaking. He leaned back, thoughtful. Maybe, he said quietly. Or maybe we just loved people who didn't know what strength really looked like. That sentence landed somewhere deep inside her. She exhaled slowly, blinking back the sting in her eyes. They sat like that for a while, three people suspended in a fragile peace, listening to the sound of rain against the glass. Anna had begun drawing shapes on a napkin with a spoon, humming under her breath. Janet found herself watching the child's small gestures, the way her curls bounced when she leaned close to whisper something to her father. She felt something stir in her, something she hadn't felt in months, the quiet ache of life continuing. Richard, she said after a while, how do you do it? How do you keep going like nothing's wrong? He smiled faintly, his eyes tired but kind. Sometimes strength, he said, is just pretending you're okay until it's true. Janet looked out at the street, where the puddles reflected bits of sky. Pretending until it's true. That sounded familiar. Maybe that's what she had been doing all along, pretending to be unbreakable after the accident, pretending she was fine when Ethan looked at her with quiet pity. But hearing him say it somehow made it feel less like denial and more like survival. They fell silent again, but this time it was a comfortable silence. The kind that doesn't need to be filled. Anna slid off her chair and climbed onto her father's lap, curling against him with effortless trust. He kissed the top of her head, and for a fleeting second, Janet saw a crack in his composure, the weight behind his calm, the ache of a man who'd lost too much but still found a way to stay gentle. Something inside her shifted quietly. Richard caught her watching and smiled faintly. You're quieter now, he said. I'm thinking, she replied. About? She hesitated, then said softly, that maybe I was wrong about people. Maybe some don't stay because they're scared. But others, maybe they stay because they understand. He nodded slowly, eyes never leaving hers. Maybe. The clock above the counter ticked softly, the light outside fading into a pale gold. Anna had dozed off against her father's shoulder, her tiny fingers still gripping the napkin she'd drawn on. Richard brushed a curl from her forehead, then looked back at Janet. Can I see you again? He asked suddenly. Janet blinked. What? He smiled gently, almost hesitant. Not because you need help, he said, but because I'd like to. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, unsure what to say. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't being offered pity or advice, just presence. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I'd like that too. The rain had stopped completely now. Beyond the glass, the first thin beam of sunlight cut through the clouds, landing across the table between them like a quiet promise. If you've ever met someone who showed up in your darkest moment, and didn't leave, share a star in the comments. That was how Janet learned that pain could recognize itself in another, and how a stranger's honesty could make even the heaviest grief feel a little less lonely. What neither of them realized yet was that this was only the beginning of something that would test both their hearts in ways they never expected. The days that followed passed like the slow exhale after a long storm. Janet didn't see Richard again immediately. At first, she thought maybe it was better that way. Their meeting had been strange enough, a stranger stepping into her heartbreak like he'd been sent by some unseen hand. She told herself it was just a fleeting moment of kindness between two broken people, nothing more. But the mind is never so obedient. She kept replaying that afternoon in the cafe, the smell of cocoa, the quiet steadiness of his eyes, and Anna's soft voice saying Mommy said she'd come back, but she never did. Then one morning, her phone buzzed. A simple text from an unknown number. You left your handkerchief at the cafe. Anna says it smells like rain. May we return it? She smiled despite herself. What started as that small exchange soon became something else entirely. Messages that trickled through the days, gentle check-ins that didn't feel like pity. He never asked intrusive questions or tried to fix her mood. Sometimes, he just sent a quote or a picture of Anna's drawing. Once, a photo of a crooked little heart scrawled in crayon with the words for Miss Janet. Weeks passed before they saw each other again. By then, the leaves had started to turn gold outside the rehabilitation center where Janet spent most of her afternoons. The place had tall windows that let sunlight pour in like forgiveness, and each day she wheeled herself to the same spot near the garden wall to paint watercolors as part of her therapy. That afternoon, as the light stretched long across the tiles, she heard a small gasp behind her. Daddy! She's really here! Janet turned, startled, and there they were. Richard, tall as she remembered, and little Anna, bouncing with excitement, clutching something wrapped in paper. Surprise, Richard said softly, the corner of his mouth lifting. You said you liked painting. Anna thought you could use some new brushes. The girl stepped forward, handing her the package shyly. Inside were a set of watercolor brushes tied together with a pink ribbon. They're beautiful, Janet said, her voice soft. Thank you. Anna beamed. I can paint with you. Janet hesitated. She wasn't used to company anymore, not in the spaces that had become hers to grieve and rebuild. But the little girl's eyes were so bright, so full of innocent insistence, that she found herself nodding. Of course. They sat by the wide window, the sun glazing everything in amber. Anna painted messy hearts and smiling suns, while Janet tried to capture the pattern of light spilling across the floor. Richard stood nearby, hands in his pockets, watching the two of them in silence. It was almost peaceful, until the brush slipped from Janet's fingers. She bent to pick it up, but the motion shifted her balance. The wheel of her chair snagged the carpet's edge, tipping slightly. Her breath caught. Before she could react, Richard was there, his hand steadying her chair, his body close enough that she could smell the faint scent of cedar and rain on his suit. Their eyes met, too close, too sudden. Old habit, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Wanting to keep people from falling. Janet's heart tripped. You don't have to. I know, he said, straightening slowly, but his gaze lingered, gentle and unguarded. But it's instinct now. For a moment, neither of them moved. The sunlight caught the metal rims of her wheelchair, turning them into halos. It felt absurdly poetic, but neither dared to say it. Anna's giggle broke the spell. Daddy, you're blushing. Richard laughed under his breath and rubbed the back of his neck. Busted. Janet felt something strange bloom inside her chest, something she hadn't felt in months. It wasn't quite happiness, but it was its distant cousin. She found herself laughing too, the sound surprising her as much as it did him. There it is, Richard said softly. What? That sound, he said. You should do that more often. Janet shook her head, smiling despite herself. It's been a while. He leaned against the window frame, his eyes following the golden light outside. You know, he said quietly, people talk a lot about being broken, about how they have to get back to who they were before things fell apart. He turned to her, his voice deep but gentle. Maybe you're not broken, Janet. Maybe you're just rebuilding differently. The words hung in the warm air between them, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. Rebuilding differently, she repeated, tasting the phrase like it was something sacred. That's kinder than what I usually tell myself. Anna piped up, proudly waving her paintbrush. See, Miss Janet? Daddy fixes things. Even words. They all laughed again, the sound mingling with the soft hum of the center's air vents and the distant chatter of other patients. Janet hadn't realized how quiet her world had become until that moment. How much she missed this connection, warmth, the simple act of being seen without being pitted. Over the next hour, they painted until the light began to fade. Anna's paper was a storm of color and hearts, and Janet's, well, hers had turned into something she couldn't quite define. It wasn't beautiful, but it was alive. When it was time for them to leave, Anna hugged her tightly, her little arms careful around Janet's shoulders. "Can we come again?" she asked, eyes hopeful. Janet looked up at Richard, and he gave her that same quiet, respectful smile, the kind that always seemed to ask permission before it assumed anything. "I'd like that," Janet said softly. As they walked toward the door, the sound of Anna's laughter echoing through the hall, Janet found herself whispering under her breath, "rebuilding differently." It stuck to her like sunlight on skin. The following weeks blurred into something new, an unfamiliar rhythm of small joys tucked between therapy sessions and the quiet ache of memory. Richard stopped by often, sometimes with Anna, sometimes alone. They talked about music, books, and the kind of courage it takes to wake up after disappointment. One evening, he helped her practice standing between parallel bars, the sunlight fading behind them like a slow-burning candle. Her arms trembled, sweat slicking her palms, but he stayed beside her, his hand hovering just close enough to catch her if she fell. "Don't let go," she said through clenched teeth. "I won't," he replied quietly. "But you're stronger than you think." That night, after he left, she lay awake long after the lights went out. She didn't understand why his presence made her chest feel both heavy and light at the same time. She didn't know what to call this tenderness that frightened her almost as much as it healed her. For Richard, the fear was different. He hadn't meant to care this much, this soon. The first time his phone buzzed and her name appeared on the screen, he'd felt that familiar tug, hope tangled with guilt. He'd told himself that this was about friendship, about helping someone through pain he understood too well. But every time she laughed, every time her eyes softened when she looked at Anna, he felt something shift in the quiet corners of his heart that he thought had long since gone numb. Still, they both kept their distance, or tried to. Love, they had both learned, was dangerous when your heart was still in pieces. It was a golden afternoon when it happened, the moment that would quietly unravel everything they'd been guarding. Janet had been working with her therapist when the receptionist entered the room holding an envelope. "Miss Collins, this just came for you." Janet took it, puzzled. There was no return address, just her name written in the familiar, slanted handwriting she had once traced with her finger across love letters and birthday cards. Her pulse faltered. "Ethan." She turned the envelope over in her hands, her throat tightening. Outside, sunlight gleamed off her wheelchair's rims, scattering light across the polished floor like shards of memory. Richard, standing by the door, saw her expression change. "Janet, you okay?" She couldn't answer. Her fingers trembled as she tore the envelope open, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Inside was a single folded letter. The first line made her breath catch. "Janet, I made a mistake." What would you do if the person who shattered your heart suddenly wanted to explain? Would you read the letter, or throw it away? Tell me in the comments below. That was how the piece she'd begun to rebuild cracked open again, one line of ink at a time. What she didn't know yet was that this letter would test everything she thought she'd learned about healing, and about the man who refused to leave her side. The paper trembled in Janet's hands, its faint perfume of old ink and regret bleeding into the air between her and Richard. The words blurred and sharpened again as she read them once, then twice, her pulse beating against each line like a warning drum. "Janet, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have left that way. I thought I couldn't handle it, but I was wrong. Can we meet, just once? Foreclosure." Foreclosure. Two words that felt too small for the damage he'd done. Yet they echoed in her mind for days, like the ghost of a melody she couldn't unhear. Richard didn't say anything at first when she told him. He just stood near the wide rehab windows, watching the clouds shift across the sky. His jaw was tight, his voice measured when he finally spoke. "Do you want to see him?" "I don't know," Janet said truthfully. "Part of me wants to throw the letter away. But another part," she trailed off, staring at the paper, the curve of Ethan's handwriting. "Another part just wants to understand why." Richard nodded slowly, but the silence that followed said everything his words didn't. He wasn't going to stop her, but it was clear that the thought of her facing that man again twisted something deep inside him. The next morning, she sent a reply. "One meeting. Then we are done." He chose the place, St. Matthew's Chapel. The same garden where her world had collapsed. Of course he did. Guilt has a way of circling back to the scene of the crime. When the day came, the city was steeped in gold. The evening sun filtered through the chapel's stained glass, painting fractured rainbows on the aisle floor. The scent of lilies and old stone wrapped around her as she wheeled herself inside, each rotation of the wheels echoing like a heartbeat through the hollow air. Ethan was already there, dressed simply in a grey suit, his hair a little thinner, his face drawn. When he turned and saw her, something flickered across his features. Shock, guilt, maybe even awe. He swallowed hard. "Janet," he said softly. "You look—" His voice trailed off, uncertain how to finish. She spared him the effort. "Alive," she said dryly. He gave a small, broken laugh. "Yeah. That." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them pulsed with unfinished things, questions, apologies, memories. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Ethan said finally. "Neither was I." He stepped closer, his hands twitching nervously. "I need to say this, Janet. What I did that day, it wasn't about you. Not really. I told myself it was. I said I couldn't handle your condition, the chair, the looks, the responsibility. But the truth is, I couldn't handle me. I was terrified. Of what people would think. Of how different life would be. I kept thinking love was supposed to be easy, and when it wasn't, I panicked." She let him speak, his words tumbling out like water from a cracked pipe. "I thought walking away would make it easier for both of us," he continued. "But it didn't. I've been carrying it ever since. Every time I see a wedding photo or a wheelchair ramp or a woman in white," he broke off, shaking his head. "I see you. And I hate myself for it." Janet stuttered him quietly. Once, this man's voice could undo her. Once, she believed every promise he made. Now, his apology felt like a stranger's confession. Tragic, maybe, but no longer hers to hold. "Ethan," she said gently, "you're not the villain in my story anymore. You're just someone who couldn't stay." His eyes glistened. "I was weak." "No," she said, shaking her head. "You were honest. Too late, but honest. And maybe that's something." He looked at her then with a desperation that almost made her pity him. "Is there any way you could forgive me?" Janet exhaled slowly, her hands resting on her lap. "Forgiveness isn't something I give you," she said softly. "It's something I gave myself. So I could stop carrying you." He blinked, startled by her calmness. "You've changed." "I had to," she replied. "You left me no choice." They stood there in silence, the stained glass light shifting across her face like moving water. For the first time, she wasn't angry. She wasn't sad. She just was whole, in a way she hadn't realized until now. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. "I thought I couldn't handle you," he murmured. "Turns out, I couldn't handle myself." A faint smile tugged at her lips. "Then I hope you find the courage to stay next time," she said quietly. "With whoever comes after me. Because leaving, running, doesn't save anyone." He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging as if a lifetime of regret had finally found its place to rest. "Thank you," he whispered. "You didn't have to say that." "I know." The setting sun painted everything in amber and rose. Janet looked toward the altar, the place where her old life had ended, and saw her reflection faintly mirrored in the glass behind it. For a moment, she almost didn't recognize herself. The woman in the chair wasn't the broken bride she remembered. She was steadier now. Softer, but stronger. "You didn't break me, Ethan," she said at last, her voice steady and clear. "You just showed me where I needed to heal." He stood there, speechless, as she turned her chair and began to move toward the doors. Her wheels rolled over petals that had fallen from a nearby vase, and for a fleeting instant, it felt like the universe itself was nodding in quiet agreement. Outside, the air was cool and still. The last sliver of sunlight caught the edge of her hair as she reached the garden gate, and there he was. Richard. He was leaning against the stone pillar, hands in his pockets, watching her with that same quiet intensity he always had. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything: relief, worry, something deeper that words might ruin if spoken too soon. Janet stopped in front of him, heart pounding. "You waited," she said softly. He nodded. "Of course I did." She smiled faintly, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "I didn't cry," she said. "I know." His voice was warm, but there was something raw beneath it, something like pride. You didn't need to. For a long, weightless moment, they just stood there in the fading light, neither daring to move. The world around them seemed suspended, the chapel glowing behind her, the horizon fading to dusk. Finally, Janet exhaled, her shoulders loosening. He wanted forgiveness, she said quietly. But what I found was something better. What's that? Richard asked. Peace. He nodded, his gaze soft. You earned it. Janet tilted her head, studying him. You were worried, weren't you? Richard smiled, a little rueful. Maybe a little. I know what it's like to face ghosts. She reached up, her fingers brushing his hand briefly. Then maybe it's time we stop letting them haunt us. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then he did something simple, something that felt almost sacred. He placed his hand gently on the back of her chair. Not to push. Not to guide. Just to be there. Together, they turned away from the chapel and began down the path toward the street, the sound of her wheels soft against the cobblestone. The last light of day followed them, stretching long and golden over the stones like a quiet benediction. And as they disappeared into the evening, the garden behind them stood still, no longer a place of endings, but beginnings. If you were Janet, would you have met Ethan again, or left his apology unread? Tell me in the comments below. That night, long after she'd returned home, Janet sat by her window watching the city lights shimmer below. Somewhere in the distance, she could almost hear the echo of rain against stained glass, and for the first time since that terrible day, it no longer hurt. But what she didn't know was that another storm was coming, and this one would change everything once more. The city lights flickered softly against Janet's apartment window, reflecting in her eyes like tiny constellations of thought. For weeks, the silence between her and Richard had been filled not with distance, but with something deeper, an understanding that didn't need words. Since the day at the chapel, he had become a quiet constant in her life, the steady hum beneath all the noise. So when she received the message, dinner, 7 p.m. don't say no, Anna's orders, she smiled for the first time in days. That evening, she found herself at Richard's home again. The small house glowed like warmth made tangible, golden light spilling through open windows, the faint hum of jazz playing from an old speaker, the smell of baked rosemary chicken floating through the air. Anna's laughter echoed from the kitchen, a sound so pure it wrapped around Janet's heart like a ribbon. Richard greeted her at the door, sleeves rolled up, a dish towel over his shoulder. You're just in time, he said with a grin. Anna's been interrogating me about proper table settings. Apparently, you're the only one who gets it right. Janet wheeled herself into the dining room, her eyes taking in the small but perfect chaos, plates slightly mismatched, candles flickering unevenly, and Anna humming off-key as she carried a basket of bread to the table. Hi, Janet. The little girl beamed, cheeks flushed. I made the salad. Daddy only helped a little. Janet chuckled. Then I'm sure it's perfect. As they sat down together, something inside Janet stirred, a feeling she hadn't let herself acknowledge. The table wasn't fancy, but it felt whole. There was laughter, messy conversation, and the kind of comfort that doesn't ask you to perform. Dinner unfolded in gentle waves, stories about Anna's school projects, Richard's stubborn attempts at cooking, Janet's new therapy routines. The world outside the warm glow of that room felt miles away. At one point, Richard poured more wine and leaned back in his chair, his gaze resting quietly on her. You know, he said, Anna's been asking questions about you. Oh. Janet tilted her head. Serious questions, he said with a mock sigh. Like whether you like pancakes or waffles, and if you know how to make clouds with cotton balls. Anna giggled. That's because I need to know before the trip. What trip? Janet asked, curious. Anna glanced at her father, eyes wide with excitement. My birthday trip. Daddy promised we'd go to the lake this year. There's a cabin and boats and stars so bright they look like they're falling. Can you come? Janet froze, mid-smile. The question hit somewhere she didn't expect, that tender space between belonging and fear. Sweetheart, Richard started carefully, we haven't talked about. Why not? Anna interrupted. Janet's our friend. It wouldn't be the same without her. The room went quiet for a heartbeat too long. Janet looked from Anna's hopeful face to Richard's uncertain one. He hesitated, not out of rejection, but something else. Vulnerability flickered across his expression like candlelight, soft but real. Janet broke the silence with a small laugh that tried to sound casual. I'm not sure I'm built for birthday trips, she said lightly. I don't exactly make the best hiking buddy. Anna frowned. You don't have to hike. We could draw or look at stars. You could teach me how to paint the clouds. Richard smiled faintly, but Janet caught the hesitation beneath it. That same fear she carried herself. Fear of crossing the invisible line where kindness becomes care, and care becomes something riskier. Dinner continued, the warmth returning slowly. But Janet could feel it lingering in the air, the unspoken thing. Later, when Anna went upstairs to get ready for bed, Richard began clearing the dishes. Janet helped fold napkins, the quiet between them charged yet gentle. You know she adores you, he said finally. I adore her too, Janet replied. He looked up, meeting her eyes. It's more than that. You've brought something into her world I couldn't. Hope, maybe. Janet swallowed, her throat suddenly tight. You give her that every day, Richard. He smiled, faint and wistful. I try. But sometimes it's hard to be both parents, you know? You end up forgetting you're allowed to just live. She hesitated, then said softly, You are living. Look at her. Look at this. She gestured around the warm, flickering room. This is what living looks like. He nodded, setting the last glass down. I guess I just don't always feel like I deserve it. Janet stared at him for a long moment. Maybe you do. Maybe we both do. They stood there, the air thick with all the words they didn't say, about pain, about connection, about the terrifying possibility that love might find its way back into their lives when they least expected it. Finally, Richard exhaled. I used to think love meant walking side by side, he murmured. But maybe it just means moving forward, together. Janet felt her breath catch. The room seemed to shrink around them, every sound fading except the quiet pulse of her heart. She wanted to respond, but words felt too fragile. Instead, she smiled, small, genuine, a promise wrapped in silence. Then Anna's voice broke through from upstairs. Daddy, you forgot the bedtime story. Richard chuckled, the spell gently breaking. Judy calls, he said, picking up a plate. Go, Janet said softly. I'll finish here. He paused in the doorway, looking back once more. You sure? She nodded. Go make memories. That's what you do best. When he was gone, Janet sat for a while in the candlelight, tracing the rim of her glass absently. The laughter still echoed faintly from the stairs, Anna's bright, unfiltered joy, Richard's deeper, rumbling chuckle. For the first time in years, Janet felt something she hadn't dared to feel, safe. Not because nothing could hurt her, but because she finally believed she'd survive it if it did. But safety had its shadow too, a whisper of doubt that slid beneath her ribs as quietly as the night settling outside. She wanted to believe this peace could last, that she could belong here without fear of breaking something sacred. Yet deep down, that old wound murmured, love doesn't stay. It never stays. She closed her eyes, willing the thought away. The clock ticked softly. The last candle flickered. And just as she was about to turn off the lights, the front door creaked open. Richard stood there, his expression changed, the calmness gone, replaced by something raw and shaken. Richard? Janet asked, her chest tightening. What's wrong? He didn't answer immediately. He ran a hand through his hair, his breath uneven. It's Anna, he said finally, voice cracking. The hospital just called. Her heart dropped. What happened? He swallowed hard. Her cardiologist reviewed the new tests. Her condition's worsening. The words hung in the air like shattered glass, sharp and final. Janet felt the room tilt around her, the warmth evaporating into cold. He leaned against the doorframe, eyes glassy. They want to run more tests. Talk about next steps. Janet reached out, her voice trembling but steady. Then we face it. Together. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he nodded, as though the weight of those words was the only thing holding him up. The candles flickered out, one by one, leaving only the faint hum of the city beyond the windows and the silence of two hearts bracing for another storm. If you were Janet, could you open your heart again while knowing loss might be waiting? Tell me what you think in the comments. Your thoughts always bring this story to life. By morning, the house was quiet again. But the peace that once lived there had changed. Somewhere in that silence, fear and hope began their quiet war, and for Richard and Janet, nothing would ever be the same again. The next 48 hours blurred into a nightmare. Hospitals had a way of swallowing time, endless corridors, colorless walls, the scent of antiseptic clinging to every breath. Richard moved through it like a man walking underwater, every step heavy with disbelief. Janet stayed close, her wheelchair trailing beside him through the maze of emergency doors and white coats. When they finally reached the pediatric cardiac ward, the sound hit them first, the rhythmic pulse of monitors, the low hum of machines keeping fragile lives alive. Behind one of those glass partitions lay Anna. Her small frame was dwarfed by tubes and wires, her skin pale as porcelain against the sterile sheets. Richard froze at the sight. His hands clenched at his sides as if sheer will could hold her together. Janet wheeled closer, her heart tightening. She'd been on the other side of this before, the side of the bed where fear sat heavier than grief because there was still something left to lose. She knew that helplessness. She could feel it in the air like static. Richard sank into the chair beside Anna's bed, his composure cracking for the first time. His voice came out rough. She was just fine a week ago. Laughing. Running. How does it change this fast? Janet didn't answer. There were no words that could hold that kind of terror. Instead, she reached for his hand, not to comfort, but to anchor. The doctor entered quietly, a clipboard pressed against his chest. "Mr. Franco," he said softly, "the tests show a decline in her heart function. We'll need to prepare for surgery, sooner rather than later." Richard looked up, eyes wide, almost pleading. "You said last time she was stable." The doctor sighed. "She was. But heart conditions can turn quickly. We're moving her to ICU for observation before the procedure." As the doctor left, Richard buried his face in his hands. "I can't lose her too," he whispered, voice shaking. "I already lost her mother. I can't." Janet reached out again, her tone steady despite the ache in her chest. "Then don't face it alone." He lifted his head slowly, eyes rimmed red. She held his gaze, not with pity, but with quiet strength. "You've been holding everything up for so long," she said. "But you don't have to this time." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The machines beeped steadily beside them, a fragile metronome of life. Then Richard exhaled, the fight leaving his shoulders. He didn't thank her, didn't speak at all, but his hand stayed in hers. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. The sun outside sank behind the hospital walls, leaving behind a wash of amber that faded into sterile white light. Janet sat there the entire time, watching the rise and fall of Anna's chest, remembering what it felt like to depend on machines, to wait for a body to remember how to live. At some point, Richard dozed off in the chair, exhaustion finally claiming him. Janet stayed awake, her mind drifting between prayers and memories. Her own hospital bed, the metallic taste of medication, the silence after bad news. But unlike back then, she wasn't alone this time. When Richard stirred awake, he found Janet still there, watching over Anna with that same calm she carried like armor. "You haven't moved," he said quietly. "I know what it's like to need someone there," she replied. He rubbed his eyes. "You really don't have to do this." She smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But I want to." There was no grand gesture, no cinematic swell of music, just two tired souls sitting in the glow of machines, holding onto a child's fragile rhythm as if it were the only thing keeping them both from falling apart. At dawn, Anna stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, a soft sound escaping her lips. "Daddy." Richard was on his feet instantly, leaning over her. "Hey, sweetheart. I'm here." Anna blinked slowly, then turned her gaze toward Janet. "You're here too," she whispered. Janet smiled through the tears she didn't realize were falling. "Of course. I couldn't let your dad have all the fun." Anna's lips curved faintly. "You two look tired." Richard chuckled, though his voice cracked. "We'll sleep when you're better." For a few precious minutes, the room softened, the beeping less harsh, the air lighter. Janet watched the way Richard's eyes softened when Anna smiled, and she realized that this man, this quiet, steady man, carried love the way most people carried fear. It was what made him so strong, and what broke him just as easily. When the nurses came to prepare Anna for surgery, Richard stood frozen again. Janet placed a hand on his arm. "Let her see your strength," she said. "Even when you're scared." He nodded, but his voice trembled when he whispered to Anna, "You're the bravest girl I know, okay? You're going to be just fine." Anna smiled faintly. "Because you'll be here when I wake up." "Always," he said. As they wheeled her away, Janet saw his hands trembling. When the doors closed, he sank back into the chair, every ounce of strength he had gone with her. "I don't know how to do this again," he said. "I thought I'd already been through the worst. Watching someone you love disappear behind hospital doors, it never gets easier." Janet looked at him, her voice quiet but unwavering. "Sometimes the bravest hearts aren't the ones that beat strongest," she said. "They're the ones that keep beating after they break." Her words landed like a whisper of truth, one that reached somewhere deep inside him. The hours that followed crawled by. Every sound, every footstep, every beep from a monitor outside, felt like a question mark. Richard paced the floor. Janet waited in silence. Occasionally, he'd stop and stare at the door, his jaw tight, his hand shaking. Finally, after what felt like forever, the surgeon appeared. "She made it through," he said, his tone calm but cautious. "The procedure was successful. She's stable for now." Richard didn't move at first. Then, slowly, his knees gave way, and he sank into the chair, covering his face as tears broke free. Relief, disbelief, exhaustion, all tangled together. Janet wheeled closer, resting a hand on his shoulder. "She's okay," she whispered. He nodded, still shaking. "You stayed," he murmured, voice raw. "Of course I did," she said softly. Later, when they were allowed to see Anna, the child was pale but breathing on her own, a small smile flickering when she saw them. "Told you I'd come back," she whispered weakly. Janet's throat tightened. "You always keep your promises." Richard stood there for a long while, watching the steady rise and fall of his daughter's chest. But something had changed in his eyes, the light of relief dulled by the shadow of fear. When Janet turned to him, ready to say something, he was already pulling back, retreating into himself. "I need some air," he said quietly, before walking out into the corridor. She watched him go, confusion and worry twisting inside her. She understood now. The surgery had saved Anna, but Richard's heart had begun to shut down in a different way. The closer he came to losing her, the more afraid he became of feeling that love again, of daring to believe that joy could last. Janet looked back at Anna, who was already drifting into sleep, and whispered to herself, "He's afraid to hope." Outside the room, through the glass, she saw Richard leaning against the wall, staring at nothing, his shoulders heavy with a grief that hadn't even happened yet. The story wasn't over, not for Anna, not for him, and not for Janet, whose heart ached with both empathy and something deeper she didn't dare name. If someone you loved kept pulling away because of fear, would you chase them, or let them go until they're ready? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. That night, the hospital halls glowed dim under fluorescent light. Anna slept peacefully, machines humming in rhythm. But down the corridor, Richard sat alone in the dark, wrestling with a truth that terrified him more than loss itself, the truth that he was starting to need Janet just as much as she needed him. A year passed. Seasons turned, and so did the quiet tides of grief and hope. The hospital days had faded into memory, replaced by checkups, cautious smiles, and the slow rebuilding of something that neither Janet nor Richard dared to name. But time has a way of revealing what silence tries to hide. And though Anna recovered beautifully, her laughter once again echoing in sunlit kitchens and quiet gardens, something between her father and Janet had changed. It wasn't anger. It wasn't distance born of conflict. It was fear, subtle but steady, the kind that creeps in when you realize you've fallen in love again, and the last time you did, it cost you everything. By the time spring came around again, Janet had learned to live with absence. She had stopped waiting for Richard's calls, stopped rereading their old messages. Their connection, once alive with warmth and curiosity, had dimmed into polite updates and long silences. He had withdrawn, retreating behind the walls that grief had built years ago, and she had decided not to knock anymore. Now, under a sky painted with streaks of orange and violet, Janet found herself back at St. Matthew's Garden Chapel, the place where it all began. The air smelled of blooming roses, not rain. The garden was alive. The same garden that had once witnessed her heartbreak now sang with renewal. And yet, as she wheeled herself along the narrow stone path, her pulse quickened with memories she couldn't quite tame. She reached the archway, the very spot where her lace dress had once soaked in tears and rain. Her fingers brushed the stone railing, and for a moment, she just breathed, the cool evening air filling her lungs. It wasn't pain she felt now. It was peace. The kind that only comes when you've made peace with the pain itself. She looked down, and froze. There, on the same stone where her bouquet had fallen a year ago, lay a single white rose. Fresh. Dew still glistened on its petals. Janet's breath caught. For a moment, she thought it was a coincidence, a gardener's decoration. But something inside her whispered otherwise. She reached for it, her hand trembling slightly as she turned it over, searching for a note or name. There was none. Just the flower. Just the memory. Her lips parted, a quiet laugh escaping. Half disbelief, half ache. Of course, she whispered to the wind. It would be a white rose. And then she heard it, a voice behind her, low and steady, tinged with something she hadn't heard in months. You left something unfinished here. Her hands froze on the wheel. Slowly, she turned. Richard stood a few feet away, framed by the golden glow of the sunset. The light caught the edge of his navy jacket, the same kind he'd worn that first day. He looked older, not in years, but in the kind of way people do when life has weathered them gently. His eyes, though, were the same, kind, deep, searching. Janet's throat tightened. You shouldn't sneak up on people like that, she said softly, her voice steadier than she felt. He smiled faintly. Old habit. I guess I didn't know if I was welcome. She looked back down at the rose. You always were. You just didn't stay. He stepped closer, slow, uncertain. You once said love was about staying, she murmured, finally lifting her gaze to his. So why did you leave? Richard's jaw tightened, emotion flickering behind his composure. Because, he said after a long pause, I wasn't sure you'd still want me to. The words hung between them, soft and heavy like the dusk air. Janet's heart clenched. You decided that for me. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I watched you heal. You started smiling again, laughing, working again. You found your strength, and I didn't want to be the next person who made you lose it. Her voice trembled. You weren't supposed to protect me from pain, Richard. You were supposed to share it. That silence again, the one that had once felt unbearable but now simply felt real. He looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time, she saw the weight of his own scars reflected in his eyes. I was terrified, he admitted. When Anna got sick again, when I thought I'd lose her, I shut down. Because I knew that if I lost her and you, I wouldn't survive it. So I ran before you could see me fall apart. Janet smiled sadly. You think I didn't already see that? I saw the cracks long before you did. But you know what's worse than falling apart, Richard. He shook his head slightly. Not letting anyone help you put yourself back together. The wind stirred through the trees, scattering a few petals across the path. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell tolled 6 times, soft, slow, like a memory breathing. Richard took another step forward. I've been back here every month, he said quietly. I'd stand right there by that gate and just watch, hoping maybe you'd come back too. Hoping I'd have the courage to face what I broke. Janet blinked back the tears threatening to spill. And did you find it? The courage? He nodded once. I'm here, aren't I? Something inside her cracked open. Not the fragile kind of breaking that leaves wounds, but the kind that lets light in. She reached up and touched the rose still lying in her lap. You kept this place alive, she said softly. It's not the same garden it used to be. Neither are you, he replied. Neither am I. For a long time, they said nothing. The sun had dipped lower now, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The petals on the path glowed like fragments of memory. Janet finally whispered, Do you ever wish we could start over? Richard smiled faintly. No, he said. Because then I'd miss the part where I learned how much you mattered. Her laugh was quiet, tearful. You always did know what to say. He shook his head. Not always. Just finally saying what I should have said a year ago. He knelt then, not in grandeur, not in proposal, but simply so his eyes met hers. He placed his hand gently over hers on the armrest. I never left, Janet, he said. I just forgot how to stay without fear. Her voice broke when she whispered, Then don't forget again. The moment stretched, suspended in the amber light, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then, slowly, she leaned forward, not to kiss him, not yet, but to rest her forehead against his. And for the first time, there was no pity, no hesitation, no half-kept promises. Just 2 people who had walked through loss, through silence, through fear, and somehow still found their way back to the same garden. When they finally pulled apart, the last of the sunlight brushed across their faces. Richard rose, helping guide her chair toward the path that led away from a chapel. As they moved together beneath the archway, she whispered, It's strange, isn't it? How the same place can break you and heal you all at once. He glanced down at her, eyes soft. Maybe that's what love really is. The place you keep coming back to, even when it hurts. She smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Then I guess we both finally found ours. Have you ever returned to a place that once broke your heart, only to find it no longer had power over you? Share your story in the comments. As they reached the end of the garden path, the bells of St. Matthew's began to chime again, and this time, Richard didn't look away. He turned toward Janet, his voice low but certain. Tomorrow, he said, I want to show you something. She smiled softly. What is it? His answer came like a promise. A beginning. The next day dawned warm and bright, the kind of morning that carries no trace of the storms that came before. Sunlight spilled across the garden at St. Matthew's, dancing on dew-soaked petals and freshly cut grass. For the first time in years, Janet felt the weight in her chest replaced by something gentler, quieter, peace. When her car pulled up to the chapel gate, she almost didn't recognize it. The once grey, sambre garden had transformed into something out of a dream. Lanterns hanging from branches, white roses curling up trellises, and a small gathering of familiar faces waiting under the open sky. The same sky that had wept with her once now glowed gold, forgiving. Her heart raced as Richard walked toward her, dressed in a cream suit, no tie this time. His eyes met hers, steady and calm, carrying that same quiet warmth that had disarmed her a year ago. Beside him stood Anna, her laughter ringing out like chimes. She was scattering rose petals down the aisle that led, not to an altar, but to an arch of blooming lilies. Richard, Janet whispered as he approached her wheelchair, her voice trembling between joy and disbelief. What is this? He smiled. You said once that the garden was both an ending and a beginning. I figured it was time we made it official. Her breath caught. You mean? He nodded, lowering his gaze with a softness that made her heart ache. Not a grand ceremony. Just a promise. Our promise. The guests, a small circle of friends, the nurses from her rehab center, even the pastor who had watched her fall apart a year ago, turned toward her with quiet smiles. There was no pity here now. Only admiration. Only love. Her gown today was different. Not the old one that had symbolized everything she lost, but a new one, simple, elegant, designed for comfort and grace. It wasn't white but a soft ivory, glowing under the sunlight. Her hair was loose, curls brushing her shoulders, and a single rose, the color of hope, rested behind her ear. For a moment, as Richard took her hand and guided her toward the archway, doubt flickered through her chest like a shadow. Could she really trust this? Could she believe that after so much loss, this joy was real? He must have sensed her hesitation, because he squeezed her hand lightly. You're thinking too much, he murmured. She laughed softly, the sound trembling. I'm trying to believe it. You don't have to try, he said, smiling. You just have to stay. The words sank deep, simple but powerful. Love, she realized, wasn't something fragile or fleeting. It wasn't a miracle that arrived perfect. It was work. It was choice. It was the decision to stay even when staying hurt. The music began, soft strings and gentle piano. Anna, beaming, finished scattering her petals and turned, grinning wide. She's ready, Daddy. Everyone chuckled softly as Richard led Janet forward, not walking ahead of her but beside her, step for wheel. The garden air shimmered with sunlight, the scent of roses and laughter blending in the breeze. Every moment felt suspended, sacred in its simplicity. When they reached the arch, he knelt, not before her, but beside her, just like he had the first time they met here, when everything was still broken. But this time, there was no rain, no tears, no pain. Just two souls who had chosen to stay when life gave them every reason to run. Richard's voice was low, thick with emotion. Janet Collins, he said, his hand brushing hers. You once told me you didn't need saving. And you were right. You never did. But I'm not here to save you, Janet. I'm here to stay. Her throat tightened as her eyes filled. Around them, the world blurred, just light, air, and the warmth of his voice. You turned my worst day, she whispered, into the start of everything good. He smiled, that quiet, steady smile that had once stopped her tears in a rain-soaked garden. You did that, he said. I just showed up. Laughter rippled gently through the crowd, but even that felt distant, like the world had folded inward to this single moment. The pastor spoke softly, his voice carried by the wind. This place once witnessed heartbreak. Today, It witnesses healing. Love is not perfect, but it is present. And that presence is enough. As the ceremony went on, Janet barely heard the words. Her heart was too full. Every memory, every scar, every tear seemed to find its purpose in that moment. Because for the first time, she understood. What broke her had also built her. Every piece of her life had been leading here, to this garden, to this man, to this peace. When it came time for their vows, Janet spoke first. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. A year ago, I thought my life had ended. I thought love meant walking beside someone who never faltered, who stayed strong for you. But I was wrong. Love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing to stand, or sit, together when everything else falls apart. You taught me that staying is the bravest thing we can do. And I promise. I'll stay. Richard's reply came quietly, but with a conviction that wrapped around every heart present. And I promise that when the world feels heavy again, and it will, I'll remember this garden, this moment, this choice. Because love isn't what we fall into, Janet. It's what we build. Every day. Together. The wind picked up, scattering rose petals across the aisle like a blessing. Anna clapped her hands, laughing as the petals swirled around them like tiny dancers. Everyone rose to their feet, not in applause, but in reverent silence. There was something sacred in the simplicity of it all.
No orchestra, no grandeur.
Just light. Just love. Just two people who refused to let brokenness be the final chapter. When Richard leaned in and pressed his forehead against Janet's, the crowd melted away. You're my home now, he whispered. Her reply was soft but sure. And you're my beginning. For a long time, they stayed like that, forehead to forehead, breathing the same air, surrounded by laughter and life. Then Anna's small voice broke through the quiet. Daddy, is this where Mommy would be happy? Richard turned, eyes glistening. He smiled gently at his daughter. I think she'd be proud that we learned how to keep loving. Anna nodded, then ran off to chase the petals still floating in the breeze. Janet watched her for a moment, heart swelling with something deeper than joy, gratitude. For pain that hadn't destroyed her. For loss that had made room for more love. For a garden that proved broken things can still bloom. The guests drifted away, the music softened, and the light began to fade. Richard stayed beside her, their hands still intertwined. Do you remember the first time you saw me? She asked quietly. He chuckled. Crying under an archway, covered in rain and mascara. Exactly, she said, smiling. And now look, same woman, same place, completely different ending. He leaned closer, his voice a whisper against her ear. That's because this time, the right person stayed. She looked out across the garden, her eyes catching the faint shimmer of sunset on the rose petals scattered like blessings. Maybe this place was never cursed, she murmured. Maybe it was always waiting for us to finish the story. Richard nodded. And now we have. But Janet smiled, her gaze soft and certain. No, she said. Now, we are just beginning. The camera of life seemed to pull back then, the laughter fading into music, the roses glowing in the last of the sunlight, the two of them framed beneath the arch that had once symbolized heartbreak but now stood for healing. As the final light of day kissed the chapel stones, the garden seemed to breathe, alive, radiant, whole. The same garden that once witnessed Janet's heartbreak now held her vows, a living testament that even broken things can bloom again.
Thanks so much for watching till the end. If this story moved you, you're going to love what's coming next. It's even more surprising and emotional than this one. Go ahead and click the story on your screen right now, and see you in the next story.